A profound crisis of faith is unraveling the core of the Russian military as frontline soldiers, enduring a brutal winter with inadequate supplies and witnessing the economic collapse of their homeland from afar, are increasingly turning their disillusionment toward President Vladimir Putin. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, reports from the front lines, intercepted communications, and social media posts paint a picture of a fighting force that no longer believes in the mission or the leader who sent them there. The combination of a tingy economy, international isolation, and the physical misery of a winter campaign has created a perfect storm of demoralization. Soldiers are openly questioning the rationale for a war that has brought Russia nothing but pariah status and economic ruin, while their own families back home face soaring prices, food shortages, and a frozen future. This erosion of loyalty at the tip of the spear represents perhaps the most significant internal threat to the Kremlin's war effort since the invasion began. What is happening is a slow but unmistakable shift in the psychology of the Russian soldier. In the early months of the war, propaganda and a sense of historical grievance fueled the ranks. Now, after years of attrition, the troops are drawn largely from poorer, rural regions, motivated by economic desperation rather than ideological fervor. These men, many of whom signed contracts for the money, are now trapped in a war of attrition where survival is the only objective. Testimonies collected from Ukrainian drone intercepts reveal conversations filled with complaints about incompetent commanders, a lack of rotation, and the pointlessness of their sacrifices. The winter, once considered Russia's historical ally, has turned against them. British military intelligence confirms that winter conditions are exacerbating low morale, with soldiers lacking adequate cold weather clothing and accommodation suffering from non-freezing cold injuries. The so-called golden hour for saving wounded soldiers is halved in winter, making every skirmish more deadly. How this crisis of faith developed is rooted in the systemic failures of the Russian state. The economy, pushed into what former central bank advisor Alexandra Prokopenko calls the death zone, is now consuming itself to fuel the war. This directly impacts the soldier. While the defense industry churns out tanks and shells, the civilian economy that supports soldiers' families is left in the cold. Inflation spirals, interest payments on government debt exceed spending on education and healthcare, and workers face unpaid wages or layoffs. A soldier fighting in the snow knows that his wife and children are struggling to afford basic food at home. The Kremlin's isolation from Europe and its neighbors compounds the sense of existential contraction. Russia is no longer connected to the prosperous world it once aspired to join. It is a fortress under siege, and the soldiers are the ones manning the walls for a leader who seems increasingly detached from their reality. This matters profoundly on the global stage. A Russian army that loses faith in its commander-in-chief is an army that cannot fight effectively and that changes the strategic calculus of the entire war. If Russian troops begin to refuse orders, surrender in larger numbers, or fragment into mutinous factions, the front line in Ukraine could become dangerously porous for Moscow. For NATO and Ukraine's allies, this internal decay presents both an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity is a potential battlefield collapse that could lead to a negotiated end to the war on Kyiv's terms. The risk is that a desperate Kremlin, facing a mutiny, might lash out unpredictably, escalate the conflict, or lose control of its own nuclear arsenal. Furthermore, the spectacle of a major power's army turning on its leader sends a chilling message to authoritarian regimes worldwide about the limits of propaganda when confronted with the physical reality of a failed war. Historically, Russian soldiers have endured immense hardship, from Napoleon's invasion to the two world wars, but in those conflicts, they were defending the homeland. The current war is an offensive war of choice, fought on foreign soil for reasons that become less clear with each passing month. The myth of General Winter protecting Russia is inverted. Now the cold is punishing the attacker, not the defender. Ukrainian forces, dug into prepared positions with functioning logistics, are better equipped to withstand the elements than the Russian infantry advancing on foot across open ground. This role reversal is psychologically damaging. The Russian soldier has been taught that winter is his ally. Discovering it is his enemy breeds a deep, existential confusion. The historical resonance of past Russian military glories rings hollow when the only glory on offer is a frozen grave in a foreign field. The political implications for Vladimir Putin are severe and potentially regime-threatening. The Russian military is not just an institution, it is the bedrock of the Putin system. The security services and the army are the ultimate guarantors of his power. If disaffection spreads from the conscript and contract soldier ranks into the officer corps, the Kremlin's internal stability fractures. The Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service reports that lawlessness, abuse of power, and crime are widespread in the armed forces, posing a threat to both Russian society and neighboring states. This indicates a breakdown of discipline and order that cannot be concealed indefinitely. Should units on the front lines refuse to fight, or worse, turn their weapons toward Moscow, the regime would face an existential challenge far greater than the Wagner mutiny of 2023. The political narrative of a united Russia rallying around the flag dissolves when the flag-bearers themselves lay down their arms in despair. Economically, the impact on the soldiers is mirrored by the impact on the nation. The Russian economy is now a two-tiered system. The military-industrial complex receives priority funding, while everything else is left to freeze. This creates a perverse dynamic where money spent on the war is money taken from the people. Soldiers' families see this directly. The budget deficit is ballooning, oil revenues have been halved, and the government is burning through reserves. Restaurants close, workers are laid off, and consumer spending plummets. The soldier fighting for his monthly paycheck knows that paycheck is buying less and less. The economic pain at home directly undermines the will to fight abroad. Furthermore, Russia's isolation from European markets and its neighbors cuts off the flow of goods and normalcy, making the soldier question what kind of country he is even fighting for. The social consequences are rippling through every Russian family and community. With casualty estimates reaching as high as 1.2 million, including 325,000 killed, few families remain untouched by the war. The return of wounded, traumatized soldiers to their villages and cities injects a visible, painful reminder of the war's cost into the social fabric. Communities are forced to absorb these broken men with limited medical and psychological resources. The demographic impact is catastrophic, with a generation of young men decimated or disabled. This creates a societal time bomb where resentment and grief will fester for decades. The state's propaganda machine works overtime to spin the war as a noble cause, but it cannot erase the empty chairs at dinner tables or the hollow eyes of the maimed veterans begging on the streets. International reactions to Russia's internal rot are a mixture of strategic calculation and humanitarian concern. Russia's neighbors, particularly the Baltic states and Poland, are watching the disintegration of the Russian army with alarm, knowing that instability in a nuclear power is as dangerous as a strong, aggressive one. They are bolstering their own defenses and preparing for potential spillover effects, including refugees fleeing conscription or chaos. Western allies are quietly debating how to respond to a potential Russian collapse. Some advocate for accelerating it through continued sanctions and military support for Ukraine. Others fear a leaderless Russia armed with nuclear weapons and urge caution. Meanwhile, Russia is attempting to rebuild influence in the Middle East and North Africa to offset its isolation, but these transactional partnerships cannot replace the deep integration with Europe it has lost. The world watches as a once-feared military power corrodes from within. Expert-level analysis suggests that the Russian military's crisis of faith is structural and irreversible in the short term. Military analysts point to the depletion of Russia's mechanized resources, forcing them to rely on infantry assaults that are ill-suited for winter warfare. The rate of advance has slowed to a crawl around 7 square kilometers per day because losses exceed the ability to replace them. The quality of recruits is plummeting, with recruiters targeting socially vulnerable groups, including the poor and ethnic minorities, to meet quotas. Discipline is maintained not through loyalty but through brutal punishment. Videos have emerged of soldiers tied to trees and forced to eat snow as punishment for abandoning their posts. This is not an army fighting for a cause. It is an army held together by fear and desperation, and that is a brittle foundation. What could happen next is delineated by several observable trends. The winter will continue to take its toll, with hypothermia and frostbite reducing combat effectiveness further. Recruitment rates will continue to decline as the pool of willing volunteers dries up, forcing the Kremlin to consider a new, unpopular mobilization. The economy, teetering on the edge of a banking crisis, may tip into a full-blown recession by summer, as warned by Russian officials. On the front lines, the combination of cold, hunger, and despair could lead to localized mutinies or mass surrenders. The Ukrainian military is already exploiting Russian weaknesses, launching counterattacks where Russian troops are cut off from supplies and communication. The international community, particularly the United States and Europe, must prepare for a spectrum of outcomes, from a gradual Russian withdrawal to a sudden, chaotic collapse that reshapes the entire security architecture of Europe. The erosion of faith in Vladimir Putin among those who hold the guns is the most dangerous development the Kremlin has faced, and its final chapter is yet to be written. The crisis of faith within the Russian military is now manifesting in overt acts of defiance and mutiny as frontline units crack under the combined weight of winter's fury, catastrophic losses, and a war economy that is systematically consuming the nation's future. Recent weeks have witnessed unprecedented reports of Russian officers demanding transfers to the rear and entire units refusing to execute orders around the strategic hub of Pokrovsk in Ukraine's Donetsk region. This is not the isolated discontent of a few disillusioned conscripts, it is a systemic fracture within the officer corps, the very backbone of the Russian armed forces. The Kremlin's carefully constructed narrative of a unified nation marching toward inevitable victory is crumbling in the frozen trenches of eastern Ukraine, replaced by a grim reality of drunk commanders, decimated battalions, and soldiers who no longer understand what they are fighting for. How this mutinous sentiment has spread is a story of catastrophic leadership failure, compounded by brutal winter conditions. The 74th Motor Rifle Regiment, operating in occupied Zaporizhia, has become a case study in military collapse. Troops report that commanders issue orders in states of severe alcohol intoxication, completely disconnected from the tactical reality on the ground. This has resulted in unit losses reaching up to 100 personnel per month killed and wounded, significantly higher than comparable units, leading soldiers to conclude bitterly that their fate depends not on the enemy, but on how much their commanders have consumed on any given day. Meanwhile, on the Pokrovsk front, officers of the 39th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade are submitting formal reports requesting transfer to the rear, viewing their current posting as a death sentence. The command structure responds not by addressing legitimate concerns, but through threats of disciplinary penalties, demotions, and career blocking, forcing officers to sign reports claiming a stable situation that bears no relation to reality. This institutionalized dishonesty is the final nail in the coffin of military trust. The winter itself has become a silent but devastating adversary, transforming the battlefield into a lethal environment where survival requires more than just avoiding enemy fire. Temperatures plunging to -20 degrees Celsius fundamentally alter combat dynamics, and Russian forces have proven woefully unprepared. The absence of foliage eliminates concealment, making every movement visible to Ukrainian drones equipped with thermal imaging. Soldiers attempting to advance across open ground find no shelter from the cold, and many perish from hypothermia before ever engaging the enemy. The golden hour for medical evacuation is cut in half by winter conditions. A wounded soldier left exposed faces rapid temperature loss and death long before reaching care. Russian troops report that orders are given without any understanding of these environmental realities, sending men to their deaths in conditions where even reaching the starting line of an assault is a feat of endurance. The Austrian military analysts note that both sides seek shelter in village cellars during winter, but Russian forces, constantly pushed forward by attritional tactics, are increasingly denied even this basic protection. The economic dimension of this crisis hits soldiers where they live literally. As former Russian central bank advisor Alexandra Prokopenko describes, Russia's economy has entered a death zone, metabolizing its own muscle tissue for energy. The defense sector receives priority funding, while the civilian economy is left to freeze. For soldiers fighting at the front, this means their families face soaring prices, rising utility bills, and the constant threat of layoffs. In towns like Yelets, 350 kilometers south of Moscow, residents like Irina, the ticket collector, struggle to make ends meet while simultaneously assembling aid packages for the front. She voices a confusion that echoes across Russia. In the Great Patriotic War, people knew what they were fighting for. Today, that clarity is gone. The economic pain is direct and personal. Businesses are closing at rates 15% higher than pre-war levels. Regional budget deficits have reached $21 billion, and the VAT has been raised to 22% to fund a war that increasingly feels pointless to those fighting it. The staggering scale of losses compounds this demoralization. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russian forces have suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties since February 2022, including up to 325,000 killed. In 2025 alone, Russian casualties reached roughly 415,000. These are losses unprecedented since World War II, exceeding Soviet fatalities in Afghanistan by more than 17 times. The human cost is now so immense that it permeates every Russian community. In Yelets, a mural on a 9-story apartment block honors 5 local soldiers killed in Ukraine, a permanent, unavoidable reminder of the war's toll. For soldiers at the front, the knowledge that they are participating in a conflict that has already consumed more Russian lives than any war since 1945 is profoundly destabilizing. They see their comrades fall daily, often for territorial gains, measured in meters rather than kilometers. The CSIS analysis reveals that in the Chasiv Yar offensive, Russian forces advanced at an average rate of just 15 meters per day, slower than the notoriously bloody Battle of the Somme. Why this matters globally is increasingly apparent to military analysts and intelligence services across the world. A Russian army in the throes of mutiny and demoralization cannot sustain offensive operations indefinitely. Recent data shows that Russia is now losing troops faster than it can recruit them. In January 2026, the army lost 9,000 more personnel than it gained through volunteer enlistment. The ratio on some front sectors has reached a staggering 1 to 27, meaning Ukraine kills 27 Russian soldiers for every one of its own lost. This attrition rate is unsustainable. Ukrainian forces have set a goal of increasing Russian losses to 50,000, 60,000 per month by summer 2026, a pace that would make even general mobilization insufficient to replenish ranks. For NATO and Ukraine's allies, this creates a strategic window. Russia's ability to project power is eroding not just in Ukraine but globally. As its military becomes consumed by a war of attrition, it cannot win. However, this also presents acute risks. A desperate, crumbling nuclear power facing internal military revolt may act unpredictably, lashing out against perceived external enemies to restore domestic cohesion. The international response to Russia's unraveling has been a mixture of intensified pressure and anxious contingency planning. New sanctions imposed by the United States and European Union are now biting deeper than ever before. In January 2026, Russian state revenues from oil and gas taxation fell to their lowest levels since the COVID-19 pandemic, just $5.1 billion compared to $14.5 billion in January 2025. The targeting of Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers, along with U.S. pressure on major buyers like India, has created a cascading effect. Russian oil now trades at a discount of approximately $25 per barrel below international benchmarks, directly slashing budget revenues. A staggering 125 million barrels of Russian oil sit idle in tankers at sea as buyers prove increasingly unwilling to accept delivery and risk secondary sanctions. Meanwhile, Russia's key partner India is under intense U.S. pressure to halt crude imports, with the Trump administration linking tariff reductions to energy diversification away from Moscow. China watches these developments with growing unease, unwilling to see its strategic partner collapse but equally unwilling to absorb unlimited economic costs. Expert-level analysis from multiple institutions converges on a sobering conclusion. Russia's situation is not a cyclical downturn but a structural crisis, with no easy exit. Prokopenko compares it to altitude sickness. The longer Russia remains at this economic and military altitude, the worse conditions become, regardless of rest. Interest payments on government debt this year are already set to exceed combined spending on education and healthcare, a staggering indicator of fiscal distortion. The manufacturing sector is contracting, economic growth slowed to just 0.6% in 2025, and Russia now has 0 companies in the global top 100 technology firms by market capitalization. Crucially, analysts note that demobilization would trigger an immediate economic crisis, as the defense sector that now props up GDP would collapse. Putin cannot climb down the mountain, but staying in the death zone is slowly killing the nation. The Institute for the Study of War assesses that Putin's aggressive negotiating stance is fundamentally a bluff, masking recruitment failures, inflation, and an army that cannot seize the territory he demands. The social consequences of this multifaceted crisis are now visible in every corner of Russian life. In Yelets, pensioner Ivan Pavlovich rails against a leaking pipe and a broken elevator while simultaneously defending the special military operation as excellent, a contradiction that captures the national cognitive dissonance. Bakery owner Anastasia Bykova faces soaring ingredient costs and tax hikes, watching her business model crumble while trying to maintain normalcy for her community. She articulates a fear that resonates across small business Russia. If we all shut down, what's left? Just a dark gray patch. The shelters installed at bus stops and parks across western Russia stand as concrete monuments to a war that has come home in ways unimaginable before 2022. Air raid sirens sound almost nightly in towns like Yelets, sending residents into corridors without windows, adapting to a wartime existence they never chose. What could happen next is delineated by clear structural pressures. Recruitment rates will continue their downward trajectory, forcing the Kremlin to contemplate a new mobilization wave that would be politically catastrophic. The officer corps, already fractured by mutinous sentiment, may see further erosion of discipline and cohesion. Reports of drunk commanders and mass transfer requests are early warning signs of institutional collapse. On the economic front, a banking crisis looms as consumers struggle to service loans amid rising inflation and stagnant wages. Russian officials have privately warned that a financial crisis could hit by summer 2026, driven by weak oil revenues and widening budget deficits. The military situation on the ground may shift as Ukrainian forces exploit Russian weaknesses, launching counterattacks where enemy troops are cut off from supplies and communication. The liberation of nearly 169 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory since the 1st of January 2026 suggests this process is already underway. For the global community, the trajectory points toward a prolonged period of Russian instability, with a weakened but still nuclear-armed state grappling with internal decay, an army losing faith in its commander, and an economy consuming itself to sustain a war that increasingly seems to have no purpose. The winter of 2026 will be remembered as the moment when the cracks in Russia's facade became chasms, and the men holding the guns finally began to question the man who sent them into the cold.